the female victim who was featured on Bryan Kohberger's phone is the same person that he was reaching out to on social media. So he had taken the pictures from that victim's Instagram. Bryan Kohberger followed both Kaylee and Maddie on Instagram, but Kohberger liked every one of Maddie's photos. Kohberger had liked all of Maddie's photos compared to liking just a couple of the ones on Kaylee's account. He followed both, but he liked all of Maddie's compared to liking just a couple of them on Kaylee's accounts.
Bryan Kohberger once lost 130 pounds, had a tummy tuck, worked as a fish cutter, and even lost that job years before moving to Washington State and becoming obsessed with Maddie Mogen's Instagram photos. Monroe County, Pennsylvania. The 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger has made these forested hillsides in Broadheadsville and the Pleasant Valley School District's two-story brick campus famous for all the wrong reasons. Bryan Kohberger was both a student and an employee here, a location that displays Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s saying, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." Even well into his 20s, Bryan lived with his parents on comfy Lambston Drive in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Perhaps he looked forward to 2023 and another week of eluding cops way back in Moscow, Idaho. Instead, on the 2020 eve of New Year's Eve, law enforcement broke windows in the dead of the night and ended their 7-week-long manhunt that captured the attention of the world. Kohberger, a Washington State University graduate student, was arrested in eastern Pennsylvania, about 2,500 miles from the brutal, gruesome crime scene left behind. Bryan's hometown reeled at the news. John Gress is the man who was principal of Pleasant Valley High School when Bryan graduated in 2013. John said, "For the community here, it's devastating. Out of all the schools, out of all the areas, why? It's disappointing. And I don't know if we'll ever find out why." Bryan Kohberger, as a sophomore in the 2010 through 2011 yearbook for Pleasant Valley High School in Broadheadsville, Pennsylvania. After he graduated in 2013, Bryan got a job as a part-time security officer in that school district for several years. But it wasn't Bryan's first job. He would later brag about all the things he learned on a school jobs application. Bryan wrote, "I learned how to patrol and do basic security procedures from my year in law enforcement. I was a boxer and am still a runner. I believe dedication and perseverance are the most important skills learned from my activities. I lost 130 pounds at age 15 into age 16 whilst attending school at PVHS and MCTI, better known as Monroe Career and Technical Institute. I believe this is proof that I have the required dedication to be successful." But only years earlier, Bryan was a bad fish cutter. Bryan, the bad fish cutter. More disturbingly, a few years earlier in 2011, Bryan wrote about his job at Big Brown Fish and Pay Lakes. Quote, "I cut the fish to the specifications of the customer." Is this where Bryan got familiar with using knives? 61-year-old Charles Conklin owns the fish hatchery. It has a stocked lake where people pay to fish for a variety of trout and bass. Bryan briefly worked there in the summer of 2011 for a few months, helping clean people's catch. But Charles said that Bryan wasn't there long because he didn't show himself to be a very personable person when dealing with the customers. And also, Bryan wasn't improving at filleting the fish. Therefore, Charles let Bryan go. Charles said, "You've got to do a good job on your cuts. You have to be friendly to people." At least try to make some eye contact. It just wasn't his thing. Charles said that within 1 hour of Kohberger's arrest in December 2020, he got a call from a former longtime employee who reminded Charles of the high school kid they fired more than a decade ago. The revelation floored him. Charles said, "There aren't words to describe how disturbing it was. We're a small area, small community, so for things like that to happen, shocking, totally shocking. I know this is shocking for anyone. And for him to be from this area and actually worked here, it's almost unbelievable." After Bryan got fired from that fish hatchery, he worked at BJ's Wholesale Club in 2015 as a meat wrapper. Bryan, big and bullied. Bryan was raised in a 4-bedroom home with a red roof on an acre in nearby Efford, Pennsylvania. His neighbors were astonished at the news. Year after year, their own kids had traveled the same route to school via the same corner bus stop as Bryan. He was a quiet, heavy-set boy who was bullied because of his weight. So Bryan sat up front and mostly kept to himself. All these years later, he's now charged with first-degree murder for 4 college students. University of Idaho seniors Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, both 21, 20-year-old junior Xana Kernodle, and freshman Ethan Chapin, also 20. According to 58-year-old Barbara Toker, who's a neighbor and mother of one of Kohberger's classmates, no bells ever went off. Barbara's daughter told her she never noticed any red flags. Regarding Bryan's crimes, Barbara said, "It makes me sick in my stomach. You never know. You just never know." 27-year-old Notori Green grew up just 4 homes away from Kohberger. They both graduated from the same high school in 2013. Notori spoke with the Idaho Statesman from her driveway. You see it on the news. It's surreal. When Notori moved back home after college, she learned about several Pleasant Valley classmates who have passed on, whether it's drugs, car accident, drugs, military, or drugs again. Obviously, substances are a big problem in the region. Kohberger's had his own battles, but did Bryan's battles with substances lend themselves to his current status? Notori said, "It's actually very sad, and there's a lot to take into mind and factor. We don't know why, and it's sad to hear on both sides." The alpha male. Thomas Arntz is 27, and he knew Bryan Kohberger pretty well. He said, "It's hard to put into words. It was the initial shock of hearing what he had been accused of. My first thought was, where is he now? Are my parents safe? Because you couldn't process it all at once." Thomas thought Bryan was similar to himself when they met in their early teens, both awkward and fairly reserved. Thomas and Bryan hung out together and they bonded after school and on the weekends playing video games. They would wander the wooded neighborhood together. Thomas appreciated Bryan's sense of humor, his wit, and powers of observation, ironically. But when the Idaho Statesman spoke with Thomas, he hadn't talked to Bryan in about 8 years. That's because Thomas had cut ties with Bryan due to the mind games that Bryan would play. One time Thomas was upset because his aunt had died, so Thomas told Bryan he wasn't in the mood, but Bryan kept playing his psychological mistreatment games. Thomas said he always wanted to be dominant, physically and intellectually. Thomas was 1 year behind Bryan in school, but Thomas said that Bryan had to show that he was smarter and bigger than you, and to try to put me down and make me feel insecure about myself. So much of that was a torment, and I didn't want to be around him anymore. Bryan Kohberger is pictured in a 2010 through 2011 Pleasant Valley High School yearbook photo as a sophomore, taking part in a law enforcement class at the Monroe Career and Technical Institute in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. Bryan's high school friends knew he was interested in law enforcement. His sophomore year high school yearbook shows a rotund and uniformed Bryan in the middle of a push-up during his law enforcement class class at the county's half-day technical school. According to the caption, Bryan wanted to be an Army Ranger, but Thomas said that Bryan's main interest was law enforcement. Donna Jozwiak was Bryan's guidance counselor throughout most of high school. Donna said that Bryan's parents both worked for the school district and they took an active part in attending meetings to help steer and guide their son in the right direction. Donna remembers Bryan as a good student. I recall no problems. He was a regular kid, and thankfully his parents were involved in his education. I don't recall anything that was out of the ordinary. Principal Gress, on the other hand, only vaguely recalled Bryan. That's because Bryan was enrolled half the day at the off-campus tech school, and he wasn't involved in any after-school activities offered by the school district. But the one thing that most people remember about Bryan was his dramatic weight loss. It happened between his junior and senior years. Bryan losing weight, getting a tummy tuck, and gaining new friends. Thomas said that Bryan began kickboxing every day after school and running in the evenings with a neighbor.
I used to go on night runs with him because I didn't want to go running at night by myself, so I would text him hey, you want to go for a run? We go for 6-7 mile runs at night. So when I saw who it was, I was just in complete shock. I'm still kind of shaking knowing about that. It's just unreal to think somebody could actually do that to somebody. It's absolutely mind-boggling. My adrenaline's still kind of running after finding that information out. So just I feel for the families, and I'm just happy justice can be served now. So.
According to his friends, Bryan became so hyper-focused on what he ate, he developed an eating disorder that required hospitalization. Jack Bayless is now 28, but he was a part of Bryan's inner circle at the time. Bryan's friend Thomas figured that Bryan probably weighed more than 300 pounds, and the amount he lost was as much as half of his body mass. According to Bryan's own words about his 130-pound weight loss, Thomas's estimate was pretty close. But according to both Thomas and Jack, Bryan's weight loss was so fast and so dramatic that Bryan had tummy tuck surgery because he was left with so much loose and excess skin after his weight loss. Bryan's high school yearbook photos bear witness to his transformation. Thomas told both the FBI and the Idaho Statesman that was the time when Bryan's personality also changed, making him more aggressive. Thomas said, "It almost seemed to me he had a desire to be the alpha. For no reason, he tried to grapple me and put me in headlocks when I didn't want to. He tried to portray it as just boys being boys, but that's not the way I ever took it." Years later, when Thomas enlisted in the U.S. Army and was deployed overseas, Bryan sent him a Facebook message offering his congratulations. Bryan also offered an apology for how he treated Thomas when they were younger, but Thomas never responded. Adulting and addiction. Monroe County borders New Jersey, not far from the New York state line. Bryan could readily get stuff. According to Bryan's friends, he developed a marijuana habit that devolved into heroin addiction. Bryan Kohberger in his senior photo from the 2012 through 2013 yearbook for Pleasant Valley High School in Broadheadsville, Pennsylvania. The period between his junior and senior years was marked by significant weight loss. Bryan attended the county's tech program his sophomore and junior years of high school, but during his junior year, Bryan switched from law enforcement to focus on HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, just like his dad Michael, who worked in maintenance at the school district for a time. According to his guidance counselor Donna, and for unknown reasons, Bryan transitioned out of the technical school his senior year to earn his high school diploma through the high school's online program. That had to be something a lot less popular in Bryan's day. Bryan wrote, "I am capable of what is considered pipe work. I can solder, attach pipes, and do some basic HVAC. I learned this from my father." And then Bryan added, apropos of nothing, in the middle of this application, where he brags about his skills, "I was the District 11 Skills USA Regional Champion in 2011, for extemporaneous speaking. Then it was back to HVAC. I learned how to do more HVAC at MCTI. Both Bryan's HVAC instructor and his law enforcement instructor ignored interview requests from the Idaho Statesman. But Tanya Carmela Beers, a technical school administrator who oversaw student discipline and mental health, she remembered Bryan. However, Tanya would not reveal specifics about Bryan because of the Federal Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. But Tanya pointed to certain general circumstances that could force a student like Bryan to change his focus within the program. Tanya said, sometimes, depending on the disciplinary offense and any issues surrounding it, it may not be the student's choice to be removed from a program, particularly a program that might have many rules and regulations in place. In general, a student can be very strong academically and perform very well in clinical work, but one or more infractions would take the opportunity to participate in that program away. 29-year-old Casey Arntz went viral on TikTok because of her videos about Bryan, detailing their friendship.
But regarding the case of the 4 Idaho students that were slain and the arrest that was made, I used to be friends with Bryan Kohberger during my middle and high school years. And then
Casey graduated high school 2 years ahead of Bryan, and she was his friend just like her younger brother Thomas. Bryan, the upperclassman, began spending time with another group of high school kids, but Casey and her friends didn't gel with this new group. Casey said, honestly, I feel he was looking for validation, and that's why he fell into that crowd, and honestly, it's why he fell into the whole drug scene.
Someone, we know something's bad. She called me and asked me about the murders. I didn't know where she was going with it until she said that it was Bryan Kohberger, and naturally I freaked out. And
Jeremy Saba lived only 2 houses from Bryan's childhood home and was in the group that introduced Bryan to heroin, according to Casey, Thomas, and Jack. Jeremy and Bryan appeared on Facebook in August 2016, 4 months after Jeremy was arrested and charged with a DUI and misdemeanor possession of drug paraphernalia. According to Pennsylvania court records, Jeremy later pled guilty to both charges. Jack said, I didn't like him personally because he got my boy into heroin. Jack fell out with Bryan for several years over his drug issues. I think drugs goofed him pretty bad. He was having a hard time. He'd tell me, I'm clean now. I'm totally clean now. And he'd have bleeding track marks on his arms. Jeremy was arrested again in September 2018 for misdemeanor possession of a controlled substance. In March 2021, the 27-year-old died of an accidental drug overdose, according to the Monroe County coroner. Thomas said that in high school, Bryan also started using heroin with classmate Ashley Flugel. Ashley also faced drug charges in 2017 and 2018. In May 2018, before her court appearance, 23-year-old Ashley died of an accidental drug overdose. Bryan, meanwhile, used to frequently invite Casey to smoke weed. Back in March 2013, Bryan told Casey that he finished his online school requirements early via Facebook messages. 2 months later, Bryan asked Casey for a ride after he told her his car broke down. So Casey agreed to help him. Weeks later, Casey Arntz came to learn that Bryan's errand was actually to buy heroin and needles. Casey said, he literally used me to get it. I was freaking out and not happy I had heroin in my car and didn't even know. When Bryan tried to apologize to her more than 3 weeks later, Casey rebuffed it. In January 2014, Bryan messaged Casey. He was asking how college was going. She said she was stressed out over her school projects. Bryan wrote, be proud you're making something of yourself. I'm not. Ha ha. Bryan told her he dropped out of college because he had to go to rehab. Life after was dull. Pizza and post-recovery plot twists. Bryan also worked at a roadside pizzeria, formerly called New York Pizza Girl, from 2013 to 2014. 31-year-old Rich Pasquia is a Pleasant Valley High School graduate. These days, Rich works at a drug rehab clinic in the area. He admitted that he and Bryan would use heroin together. Rich told Fox News he didn't have many friends, so he would do anything to fit in. He was a big heroin addict, and so was I. I work in treatment and everything. But back then I was using, and so that's how I know for a fact that he was using. I got high with him a couple of times. Jack said that he reconnected with Bryan several years after they last spoke to one another. They exchanged Facebook messages. Bryan would also call Jack to talk every week or so. Bryan told him that he no longer used drugs when the subject came up. Jack said, "At some point, he said, don't ever bring it up again. We're past that." In May 2018, Bryan told Jack via Facebook messages that he hadn't used drugs in 2 years, according to the screenshots Jack shared with the New York Times. Bryan wrote, "I only used when I was in a deep suicidal state. I have since really learned a lot. Not a person alive could convince me to use it." A year before that, Casey ran into Bryan at a friend's wedding, which was the last time she saw him. Casey believed that Bryan had his life together. He looked good. She tried to give him a hug. He was still awkward. Bryan told her he was in college and working as a security officer for the Pleasant Valley School District. Casey said it was so good to see someone come back from that dark place. He was kind of very standoffish and not very sociable. I believe he left early as well. Bryan had begun working with the school district in 2016 as a fill-in custodian and courier before moving into his part-time security position. By December 2018, he was praised in the Pocono Record for helping save the life of an employee at the Pleasant Valley High School after they had a medical emergency, and Bryan retrieved a defibrillator. Bryan went on to graduate from Northampton Community College in Eastern Pennsylvania in 2018, majoring in psychology. He earned his bachelor's degree in 2020, also majoring in psychology, according to Boyce Jubilan, chair of DeSales University Psychology Department. In the interim, Bryan resigned from his security position in June 2021. He went on to receive his master's degree in 2022 from DeSales University. He received his master's through the university's online criminal justice program, according to Michelle Bogler, a professor in DeSales Criminal Justice Department. DeSales University is an hour south of the home where Bryan's parents lived, and he continued to live while in college. Shades of a spree killer. Bryan took at least one class with Catherine Ramsland. Catherine is a famous forensic psychologist who teaches in DeSales Criminal Justice Master's Program. She co-authored a book with the notorious serial murderer Dennis Rader, better known as BTK. That's what she confirmed to Lehigh-Valley-News.com about Bryan Kohberger. In the summer of 2022, before Bryan began studying in Washington State University's Criminal Justice and Criminology PhD program in August, he posted a research questionnaire to Reddit, seeking volunteers to give him all the ins and outs about their decision-making and their behaviors when they committed a crime. Professor Michelle told the Daily Mail that she did indeed help Bryan with the project, which was part of his master's thesis at DeSales. Bryan, the rude customer. 34-year-old Jordan Cyrulnik, who owns Seven Sirens Brewing Company in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, just north of DeSales, believes Bryan may have visited his tap room a handful of times from 2020 to 2022. Jordan told NBC News in December that he approached Bryan to make sure Bryan was on his best behavior while there. That's because female patrons and staff members had said that Bryan made them feel uncomfortable and made rude comments. Bryan may have even asked some women if they lived alone. Jordan told the Statesman it looked like him. His name was Bryan, and it was in that time frame. He seemed dumbfounded, finished his beer, and I never saw him again. Jordan's been hounded by the media and he has hit back against accusations that he's clout chasing. On the contrary, Jordan has turned down interviews with Dr. Phil and documentary projects underway about Bryan. Jordan said, "I don't want anything about this. He was just a customer we had to address. It was anticlimactic. I thought it would have blown over by now, but I still get calls. Bryan's bad habits follow him." Bryan was just as controversial in Wazoo's PhD program. His fellow graduate school classmates told the Idaho Statesman that during the fall semester, Bryan was increasingly condescending toward women in classroom discussions. According to the New York Times, Bryan was allegedly fired in December from his teaching assistant position for failing to meet, quote, "the norms of professional behavior." There were repeated altercations with the criminal justice professor under whom Bryan worked, and Bryan's conduct and performance didn't improve. Bryan followed at least one female student to her car. Allegedly, the university sent him a termination letter on December 19th. 3 days after the end of finals for the fall semester, which would have been Bryan's first term at Wazoo. But by then, Bryan was already back home, having already driven his much-searched-for 2015 white Hyundai Elantra with his dad all the way across the country. Bryan and his dad made it back home in Pennsylvania on December 16th. 2 weeks later, Bryan was arrested at that home on December 30th, and on January 4th, he was flown back to Idaho, where he awaits his next scheduled court appearance, currently scheduled for June. If Bryan did it, why? Donna, Bryan's high school guidance counselor, said she immediately remembered Bryan as word of the incident spread across Monroe County. She still lives there, and she was shocked. Donna, like many others, wants to see the judicial process play out properly. She said, "I'm watching the news as well as thousands of other people. I'm just hoping that this all works out and just that the truth comes out. That's all we can hope for." Bryan stalks Maddie. While Bryan's mother worried aloud on Reddit about Bryan leaving home and making friends when he left home to go west on June 26, 2022, he would eventually become obsessed with Maddie Mogen. According to News Nation, Bryan liked every single one of her Instagram photos. Bryan even had her photos on his phone. How many hours did Bryan spend screenshotting and obsessing and fantasizing over Maddie? Did he envision her as the perfect girl for him? Despite Maddie having a boyfriend, was his plan to have his name forever tied to hers when Bryan allegedly entered 1122 King Road on November 13th, 2022? Time and perhaps a trial will tell. Proverbs 14:22. Do not those who plot evil go astray, but those who plan what is good find love and faithfulness.